Well, breaking news that's just in. Burkina Faso, 3 soldiers are arrested on suspicion of plotting to overthrow the government.
The 3 militants have been arrested and presented to an investigating judge who has arrested and indicted them on charges of military and criminal conspiracy, disobeying commands, conspiracy against the security of the state and endangering the lives of others.
Now, according to a researcher and journalist on security and governance in West Africa, when it comes to coup attempts against the country's leader, IBRAHIM TRAORE, we haven't seen the last of it.
This attempted coup failed because, I mean, you look at the structure, you look at when he took over, he had not entirely, dissolved the previous government necessarily. His men are in charge, but there are some civilians who are assisting in that regard. He knew that this was actually something that was going to happen. If this is going to be a marsupial birth of military coup in Burkina Faso, then there ought to be a new formulation of policy in terms of democracy, in terms of the system of governance, in terms of structure, to be able to actually consolidate what Burkina Faso has at the moment, because now it has won itself, so to speak, at this moment from the French influence, and now trying to reach out to Russia, almost as if all the former colonies of the French government are all now winning themselves off their colonial masters, and then get the embrace that of the Western side. This, and I can say for a fact that we are not seeing the end of it.
So, is anyone really surprised about this? I mean, there is a certain predictability about how the dark forces of the West operate. There is that predictability because they have a long track record of doing things like this. Now, I hope this is an eye-opener to these fresh governments. If they've not been, paying attention, if they thought the fight was won, this is an eye-opener to get them to tighten up their own securities. There are always traders who will connive with these forces to keep their people in perpetual slavery. Africa has been in perpetual slavery not just because of what the West have done, but because they have had partners in Africa that help them to do this. So it's a warning to all of the new governments in Niger, Mali, in Gabon, that the dark forces are still working very hard in the shadows like they always do to get to them. Now tell me if you doubt that, this is a case of, the voice of Jacob and the hands of Esau, like it says in the Bible. Tell me why anyone will want to usurp this government that's just been a few months or a few years in power. What have they done wrong? Why do you want to remove them? There is no reason except that you're working with some people who want them removed for other purposes. Quite honestly, I've been expecting this to happen, and I've been praying that it fails. And happily, the first attempt has failed. And this is just the first attempt. This is not over yet. So these new governments should be really careful and pay attention to everything and everybody around them, because it only takes someone to accept a bribe. It only takes someone, some greedy person who does not have the love of his brothers and sisters in their hearts, to take money from the dark forces and spoil everything that is going on. I hope these coup plotters are used to set an example that strikes fear in the hearts of every other would-be traitor. Africa really needs to move on, and we cannot afford to allow any traitors derail this movement. Enough is enough.
Burkina Faso is a country in West Africa. It is not a rich country when compared to other countries within the continent. but Burkina Faso has over the years gained repeated mention in history. It has seen several coups, with some of the coups being very bloody. This is the country of birth of the legendary Thomas Sankara, who was killed in a military coup in October 1987. Burkina Faso continues to make history, and recently it witnessed 2 military coups in 1 year. In this edition of Back in History, we present to you the story of the 2 coups and the presidents that emerged from the coups. Welcome to this edition of Back in History. In the year 2011, the world witnessed an unprecedented uprising in Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain. The rulers of these countries were deposed, and the uprising was known as the Arab Spring. Governance structures were disrupted in these countries, and since then, there was an upsurge in terrorist activities in the countries, and the terrorist activities have spilled over to other countries within the African sub-region, and these countries have had to deploy huge resources, human and material, to contend these forces. One of the countries that has been seriously hit by terrorist activities since the Arab Spring is Burkina Faso. Scores of humans have been killed and properties destroyed by sheer acts of terrorism, mostly by invading groups. Several militia groups with strong affiliation with similar groups in Niger and Mali have carried out several terrorist attacks on Burkina Faso for more than a decade now. This has led to a situation where more than 1 million of the country's 21 million inhabitants have been rendered internally displaced. This has become a source of worry for an average person in Burkina Faso. It has also been a source of worry to successive governments. As a matter of fact, for several years now, the strength of leaders in Burkina Faso is measured significantly from the standpoint of their ability to fight and contend with the terrorist groups and make Burkina Faso safe for its people. In other words, the inability of the government in Burkina Faso to contend squarely with the terrorists is an indication of weakness and failure on the part of that government, and as history has shown, this has been the major reason behind the frequent change of government in Burkina Faso. In 2015, elections were held in Burkina Faso for the election of a civilian president for the country. The election was won by Roch-Marc Christian Kabore. Kabore went on with his administration and completed his first term and won election for a second term. During his tenure, he was largely accused of not doing enough to contend the terrorist forces that had inflicted so much pain to the people of Burkina Faso. On 24th January 2022, he was removed from office in a military coup and detained. His cabinet was immediately dissolved and parliament and the constitution suspended. The reins of power was immediately taken over by Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henry Damiba, who served as the interim president of the country with immediate effect. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henry Damiba went about his government and promised to improve security and return the country back to civilian rule. His administration waged a serious battle with the fundamentalist forces with a view to chasing them out of the country and preventing them from further entry. He did his bid and deployed soldiers and resources to assist in the fight, which had become a recurring decimal. But it seems that his tactics were not good enough. Rather than contend the terrorist forces, there was an upsurge in the spate of attacks on Burkina Faso. Terrorists, rebels, and non-state actors expanded their operations and took control of almost 40% of the country. Several military officers and civilians were dissatisfied with Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henry Damiba's leadership, and on 30th September 2022, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henry was toppled in a military coup. Recall that there was a coup in January of the same year which removed civilian President Kabore and brought Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henry on board. The removal of Paul Henry in another military coup thus made it a total of 2 coups in one country in just 8 months. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henry was immediately succeeded by Captain Ibrahim Traore, who is the military head of state of Burkina Faso up to the time of the making of this video. Captain Traore is 35 years old. He has been personally involved in the anti-terrorist war and has fought at the front for several years and is seen by many as being brave and tactical in his military engagements. Captain Traore has promised to improve the security situation in Burkina Faso. Traore was born in 1988, and when he assumed power at the age of 34, he became the youngest serving president in the world. In the history of Burkina Faso, military men have been in power as president or heads of state more than civilians as at today.